Hello, 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 and welcome to episode 139 of the Rent to Rent Success podcast. And I am here today with the epic, with the super fabulous Julie Ford. Now, I heard Julie speak at Rent to Rent Live, and she dropped so many knowledge bombs. I find that I learn something new every time I attend that event. And Julie was exceptional. Lots of things I didn't know. And hopefully for you today, lots of things that you don't know. So well worth listening to the end for this one. And Julie has been in lettings for 28 years. There's not much that Julie doesn't know. And Julie worked for many years for the Citizens Advice Bureau. So she knows the system inside out. And now she's gone to the other side, thank goodness. And she's helping landlords with rent arrears. So get your pen and paper ready for a whirlwind episode. Welcome to the show, Julie Ford.
Thank you very much. And it's really, really great to be here. So thank you for inviting me on today.
Pleasure. So, Julie, let's start off with a bit about your background and your story, and what motivated you to start doing what you do today.
Okay, I mean, obviously, as you said in the introduction there, I've been in lettings and property management 28 odd years. 6 of those years I went over to the dark side and worked for the Citizens Advice as a housing and homeless law specialist. And it was at that point that I really saw the other side to renting. Obviously, prior to that, I'd seen the landlord's point of view and the mentality that all tenants were evil and all landlords were gods. And I was beginning to see a different side of things and understanding how landlords and tenants really could help each other and what the system actually held for them when there were problems. And the main key for me was just a lack of communication for both parties, really. When tenants are in rent arrears, they're usually frightened, embarrassed, so they put their heads in the sand and hope it will just go away. Landlords are pretty much in a similar boat. They're frightened because the income isn't coming in. Are they going to get repossessed by the mortgage company? Can they pay the bills? So this fear element from both parties really did seem to be the key to making ends meet, really, and getting a resolution for both parties. So after my time at Citizens Advice, I worked for some homeless charities as well, and then set up my own company, which is Gothard Row, as you mentioned. And now basically what I do all day is work with landlords and letting agents whose tenants are in rent arrears. So I can help them apply for grants, legacies and trusts to pay off those rent arrears. So landlord's got the money in the back pocket where it should be, and the tenant doesn't have the threat of eviction and that debt hanging over their heads.
It's fabulous. It's a win for everybody. And that's why I was really interested in it. Now, non-payment of rent, especially on the HMO side, isn't a big problem. Like many people who are thinking about getting into rent worry about people not paying their HMO room rents. And that is a very small problem in our experience over the last 6 years. But I know that in single let properties, it can be a huge problem. And the rents obviously tend to be much, much higher. So I know that I just wanted to mention that because just in the context of this being the Rent to Rent Success podcast. But I know that you also invest in property, Julie. So tell us a bit about that.
I do, yes, absolutely. However, I do not invest in the UK. I find the UK market doesn't suit me personally, and everybody is different. So I invest in holiday lets in France, and I've been doing that for about 6 years now. Obviously, COVID was not very kind to me or my bank balance, but thankfully things are getting back up and running again now. The borders are back open internally in France as well. So yeah, everything's back up and running, all run on Airbnb by me. And then I've got a handful of trades back in France whenever I need them.
Oh, I like that because people often say, can I do an SA, service accommodation at a distance? And you are doing it. So that's amazing. But we're not here to talk about that today, although I was very interested to hear about it. And it means you've always got somewhere to go and stay, doesn't it, on holiday, Julie?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's always a plus side.
So let's get into this. When it comes to rent arrears, what's the biggest mistakes that you see landlords making?
I say the 2 biggest mistakes are they're too quick to get a tenant in. So instead of carrying out good referencing and taking the time to get a good tenant in place, it's all rushed because getting the room let really quickly, which I understand is more important than get a good tenant in. And I would say the second biggest mistake is paperwork. I tend to find that a lot of people don't dot their I's and cross their T's. And then when something goes horribly wrong, they don't have the documents to back themselves up.
Totally. And that's why I so love simple systems. Nothing too complicated, but the simple systems help your business run smoothly. And if you're in the Kickstarter mentorship, you'll find all that in M5. So, um, Julie, that's the biggest mistake, people not having those systems in place and not doing the right paperwork. Is there anything else that you want to call out?
I would probably say from the beginning, treating tenants as friends rather than looking at it from a business. At the end of the day, the tenants are your customers and you are the service provider, whether you're in HMO, service accommodations or single lets. Being able to have that level of expectation and that professionalism to tenants at all times, I think immediately sets a precedent to how you are going to treat them should there be a problem. They know that they can approach you in a professional manner. Whereas I think sometimes if you're treating them as friends and which I get because you want to be the nice landlord and you want to, make sure everything runs smoothly, but sometimes not quite having the professional edge can put landlords on a back foot.
Absolutely. And I think where it happens, because being friendly is great. What I mean to say is friendly and professional and fair, but it's the fair part of it. It's something that you mentioned earlier on, Julie. It's having that process. If there's no process, then that's where friendly goes wrong. But if you have a friendly approach when delivering a process, then it's different. And so we found this when I was first doing it myself, it was different. And maybe I did go wrong, but when I passed it over to team members, then they obviously couldn't do some of the things that I'd been doing, and we came up with a new approach, which is more process based. So we're getting into the meat and potatoes of this now with eliminating rent arrears in 7 steps. I love that you have this model, and I'd love you to walk us through the 7 steps then, Judy.
Okay, absolutely. So what I'm going to talk about is basically how you get from having rent arrears previously with your tenants to being able to eliminate rent arrears before the tenancy even starts, which is basically what we all want. None of us want rent arrears. Now, as I said a little bit earlier, it's all about paperwork, getting your procedures and your systems in place. And where this really starts is with good referencing. Now, I know a lot of people try and do the referencing themselves to cut corners and obviously cut costs as well, because we are all stretched, and I understand that. But paying for a good comprehensive reference is really, really important, because you're getting as much information about this complete stranger that's going to be living in your property, whether you're rent-to-rent operator or not. That is your biggest asset that you've got, and you're giving it to a stranger. You need to make sure that they are as good as they possibly can be as a tenant. The other pitfall that I see most people do is they look for the most immediate landlord's reference. Now, the plus side of that is it's the most up-to-date history of that rental for that person. However, if you've got a problem tenant and you want to get rid of them, you are going to give them the most glowing reference ever, so they are no longer your problem. So the best advice I would give is go to the landlord prior to that. That landlord's got nothing to lose by giving you a reference, because that tenant has already gone from them. So go back to a previous landlord to get a reference rather than the immediate landlord if you can. That would be probably the biggest piece of advice I would give. And then the next thing you need to do once you've got this referencing process in place is ensure that you've got a rent arrears policy. Now, this goes back to talking about systems and processes, because what I tend to find when rent arrears are a problem is there was no process in place. So if you've got an HMO, let's say you've got 5 tenants in your HMO, and they all stop paying rent at different times, are you treating those people in the same way? Or are some of them getting a WhatsApp? Maybe one of them will get a phone call. You need to make sure you've got a clear process in place so you and your staff members or any other member of your team knows exactly what to do. For example, if you go off sick and you've made a note that you've sent so-and-so a letter, then that team member knows that the next step is going to be an email or a phone call. Everyone is singing from the same hymn sheet, but also it sets the level of expectation, which I'll come on to in a bit more detail in a moment. Because if everybody knows where they stand from day one, then everybody knows what process they're going to be going through if they don't pay the rent. And making sure that's in place in the first instance, I think goes a long way to eliminating rent arrears, because your tenant will be more keen to come to you if there's a problem, because they know they're going to be treated in a professional way rather than, you know, a way that's maybe not so professional and friendly. I have heard some very shouty landlords in the past, and that's not the way to do things. I talked about setting level of expectation. Now that's really important for you and the tenants, because tenants need to know when they're coming into your property and living in your home what they can expect from you. So levels of service when you'll be coming to do property inspections, how you're going to let them know that's happening. But also when we talked about the rent arrears policy, how you're going to be dealing with the people when there are rent arrears and what you expect from them in return. So if they know that they can't pay next month's rent, if they can let you know as soon as possible, so you've got the opportunity to start working with them and getting payment plans in place or helping them apply for benefits or anything like that, that's extremely important to eliminating rent arrears. The worst thing that you can do is be in a situation with tenants that don't communicate with you, and then you're waiting and you're 3 months down the line, 3 months in rent arrears, and then you pick up the phone and go, where's my money? That's not a great approach, and it's certainly not going to get you your rent arrears back.
So we've got 1 good referencing, 2 rent arrears policy, and what was 3?
So 3 is setting the level of expectation.
Okay.
So 4 comes on to communication. Now, communication is absolutely key. And I would say whenever you've got a tenant who is a penny short or a day late, pick up the phone. Don't WhatsApp them, don't text message them, don't email them, don't send them a letter. Pick up the phone, because you will gather more information by the tone of their voice and the words that they're saying to you than you will in any communication that is written. The reason why I say that is because depending on what frame of mind you are in at the time, you read a message in that frame of mind. So you haven't had your rent, you're a little bit angry, you've got the ump, and the tenant sends you a text. You're going to read it in that mindset, not the mindset that the tenant has sent it to you in, which might be desperate, upset, crying even when they're writing it. So hearing that person's voice is extremely important, and how you word it. Never pick up the phone to a tenant and go, where's my money? Why haven't you paid the rent? Your opening question should be, you haven't paid the rent this month. Is everything okay? That complete change to the opening sentence, I promise you, will change the entire conversation and how that dialogue goes in regards to getting it resolved. So communication is really, really important. So the next one is support. Now, I don't expect you to be social workers. I don't expect you to be benefit specialists. But if the tenant is struggling, whether they've lost their job, they've reduced hours at work, give them as much information as you can to help them get the best out of the system that's available. Just have a little bit of background knowledge about the benefits that might be available to the tenant, signpost them to get universal credit, and also know really well what your local council has got to offer. We know about discretionary housing payment, we know about the homeless fund, but a lot of councils have got individual funding from, say, police commissioner's office and places like that, which have all these other funds available that tenants can tap into, especially if they're in rent arrears. So just have an idea of what your council can offer, and that support element with your tenant doesn't need to be 24 hours a day. I'm not saying be at the end of a phone and be a counsellor, we're not the Samaritans, but just have a little bundle in your arsenal of information that you can give to a tenant to help them support themselves to get out of the rent arrears. Advice, I suppose, is really the next one, but it ties in with the support. Know where to signpost them to: Citizens Advice, Step Change, any other debt charities, and again, back to the local council, because that's really important. The councils aren't there to tell them to stay put until the bailiffs come, because at the end of the day, for every person that the council has to rehouse through homelessness, that costs the council £16,000. So if you can work with the council earlier and help prevent homelessness in its entirety, you're saving the council £16,000. So it's worth bearing in mind that the council's not necessarily the most evil of people. And the last thing that I'll come on to is negotiation. At the end of the day, you want your rent paid, and the tenant might be in a situation where they just can't pay. So what do? Do you hold them to the end of the tenancy, build up a load of rent arrears knowing you're never going to get it? Or do you sit down with them and say, look, we need to work this out? Do you need to move on? Let's end the tenancy early. Deeds of surrender can be drawn up so you're not worrying about going to court and the cost of all that. Do you need to pay your tenant to leave? Would it actually be more cost effective to give the tenant a couple of £100 to move on than it would having them stay in the property, build up those arrears, and you having to go to court? Just remember, everyone's got a price and everyone's got a limit. It's just making sure you find that. Once you've got that sweet spot, you'll be able to work with any tenant in regards to the rent arrears. So those are my 7 tips to eliminating rent arrears.
I had muted myself because I was just saying to you, Julie, that I've recently moved, and at the moment, my bedroom, which is in the floor below this room, my decorator, who's amazing, is in there painting with rock music on loud. So I didn't know if it was coming through. So that's why I was muting in between. But hopefully it's not coming through. But I love this whole system, and I think it really goes along with a lot of the things that our experience has taught, especially that the 2 parts of it, the process, and also the negotiation. Exactly what you said, because people will move on for a price. I mean, nobody's going to be paying £1 million, but if you offered someone £1 million to move out, they would move. So there's always that amount, and usually the amount is or can be quite low. And sometimes it may not even be monetary. It may be help with a moving van. So I really enjoyed your case studies when we were at Rent to Rent Live. So I'd love it if you could talk about how some of this works in action.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously I did quite a few case studies at the Rent to Rent. I won't bore everybody with all of them today, but I think probably I'll talk about one of my favourites, which was a single let, but I do have some HMO ones that I'll talk about as well. And this gentleman was in 3 months worth of rent arrears in a 1-bedroom flat. And this property was fully managed by a letting agent. So you'd kind of think, why are we in 3 months worth of arrears? But anyway, that's a separate story. So the landlord contacted me and said, is there anything you can do? I said, of course, there's always a yes. Had a look at the tenant's background, ended up having a chat with the tenant for quite a long period of time. Important to ask the right questions of the tenant, find out about their background, what they do for a living, what they have done for a living, if they ever been in the armed services, they've been in prison. That's an important one because we can get funding for prisoners. So we need to know quite a lot about the tenant. And over the years, I've literally put together a criteria that I now have as a tick box system that I can work through quite quickly with tenants. This particular gentleman was a motorsport photographer. So you can imagine during COVID, there was no motorsport, there was no photography, there was literally nothing for him to do. He had no job. And as usual, he had listened to John down the pub, who knows everything. And John down the pub had told him that because he was self-employed, he couldn't apply for benefits. So he hadn't. He'd been feeding himself by going to the local church and getting handouts. And he was literally in debt with everything. His council tax, his electricity, everything. So I sat down with him. First thing we did, got him onto universal credit. Right, we know that's happening in 5 weeks' time. That's the only downside to universal credit. It takes 5 weeks for the payment to process, but we knew it was coming, so that's important. So once I'd got all that up and running and we knew that the payments were coming through, we then looked at the local council with regards to topping up his rent because his universal credit housing element wasn't quite enough to pay the full rent. So if a tenant is on universal credit housing element, they can apply for what's called a discretionary housing payment, and that pays the difference between the rent and the housing allowance. So it will pay the difference. So the tenant is then paying the full amount of rent. So no more arrears are building up. Then I looked at grants for this guy. Now, motorsport photography, I'm like, I'm going to be really scraping the barrel here. That's never come across a motorsport photographer needing my services before. But I think outside the box a little bit. Photography, that's journalism, right? Kind of, sort of. So I applied to a couple of journalism grant funders that were set up as benevolent funds for people that are struggling who are journalists. And I also found a motorsport grant funder as well, again, another benevolent fund, and applied to all 3 of those. All 3 came back and said, yes, we're happy to pay something towards the rent arrears, but we can't clear them all. So I wrote back to them all and said, right, if I divide the rent arrears between all three of you, would you each be happy to pay this amount? They all came back and said yes. So over these three grant funders that I'd applied for, I managed to wipe the rent arrears off completely, and those rent arrears were £5,600.
That is phenomenal. It's such a good story, and I think many of us don't know or are not aware of the grants. And something you touched on in there, you've got the, I don't know if you call them private trusts, then, if you will, but also the councils have some grants specifically for people. So tell us about that, Julie, because many people could check with their own council.
Yeah, absolutely. So every local council in England will have a discretionary housing payment fund. The government issue every council with a purse for this particular reason every year. The councils have to spend the amount they're given. If they don't, the purse is then reduced the following year. So it's in their best interest to spend it all, because then they'll get the same amount the following year. This can be paid for a number of reasons. Now, it can be used to pay off rent arrears. It can be used to support a tenant to move into new accommodation. So first month's rent and deposit, it can pay that. But the most important thing, and what I use it for the most, is to help tenants that are on benefits top up to the full market rent that they should be paying, so that rent arrears won't continue to accrue, and then you can just concentrate on the rent arrears. There's so many other funds available through the councils as well. So you have prevention of homelessness funds, you have financial inclusion funds, and then those are the ones that are brought in by the government. Individual councils may have their own type of funding available as well, issued from the police commissioner's office. Like I said before, sometimes these guys in certain areas will provide funding, especially if you've got high offenders, to help them be rehoused. Sometimes you can tap into that with rent arrears if someone's been in prison, or a risk of going back to prison if they lose their home. So it's always really important to understand what your local council's got available for you.
Yeah, it's there's so much to know. Listening to you, it's like you're an encyclopedia, if anyone can remember what those were. But an encyclopedia of information. So a lot of us, landlords, property managers, investors, will not have this information or know how to access it. So how can people work with you, Julie, if they've got an issue with rent arrears?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they can contact me either via my website or just drop me an email, or even a WhatsApp. Most people are contacting me by WhatsApp these days. And then what I'll do is have a conversation with you as the landlord or the rent-to-rent operator, find out the situation, find out what you've done so far, because obviously I don't want to be repeating work that's already been done. And then the next step really is me working directly with the tenant. So although it's the landlord that pays my bill, the work that I do is directly with the tenant, because it's the tenant that needs to apply for those grants, and it's the money that will be basically in the tenant's name. Now, the one thing I will say, which is really important to understand, is when I do these grant funding applications, the money never ever goes to the tenant. It is never paid to the tenant, because the tenant will spend it on suites, and what we need them to spend it on is their rent. So the grant funder usually specifies that it has to be paid either directly to me or directly to the landlord, and then they need an updated rent statement to prove that that's been allocated towards the rent arrears. So don't worry if you think, yeah, I'm working with the tenant applies for all these grants, and then suddenly they've got a couple of grand in their bank account. It doesn't work like that. The funders will want it directly to yourself or myself.
Oh, that's a good point. Now, you mentioned your website there, so do tell us, and I'll put it up on the screen.
Okay, so it's gothardrow.com.
Okay, so let me just get that up. Is that right? Is that right there, Julie?
That is, yeah, that's right.
So just to spell it out for listeners, it's GOTHARDROWE, gothardrow.com. And you can see that at rent2rentsuccess.com/139 for episode 139. We'll have the video there, and also in the show notes, we'll have gothardrow.com. So you can contact Julie. And I was surprised to find that it wasn't as expensive as I would have anticipated to work with you. So can you give people an idea of how it works cost-wise?
Yeah, absolutely, of course. So it is on a case by case basis. So depending on how many grants I need to apply for or how many tenants I'm working with at any one time. But if you look at the average cost of eviction, so from serving your Section 21 notice all the way through to getting your bailiff warrant, if you're doing it yourself, you're probably looking at a couple of grand. If you employ a solicitor, you could probably double that. Now, if you employ my services, and obviously we're looking at getting you the rent arrears back as well, so that's your added bonus. I would say on average, most of my clients pay somewhere between £200 and £400 for my services, and that includes them getting their rent arrears back as well.
I just thought that was phenomenal when I heard it. I mean, it's a total no-brainer to go down that road and work with Julie. So you've given us the 7 steps. Good referencing. I wrote them down. Good referencing, a rent arrears policy, setting a level of expectation, communication, support, advice, and negotiation.
Absolutely. It's a shame I can't get them in some kind of order to have an acronym for them, but it just won't
Yes,
work.
that would be fun. And what was I going to say? I was going to say, so overall, with people you see doing well and not having so many rent arrears, what would you say if there are a few secrets to success? What would they be?
I think the secrets to success really is looking at your business as a business. I think maybe there's too many people that see it as it's personal to them, which I understand. I mean, when I started my business, everything was personal to me. If I got a bad review on Google, it was me they were attacking, not the business, you know. So I get it. But I think from day one, you have to understand this is a business, and also have a really good understanding of the legislation that is around you, because at the moment we have 168 laws and 402 regulations that govern the private rented sector. And no, you don't need to know them all, but you need to have a really good idea of the most important ones. And at least 80 or 90 of those laws have come into effect since 2004. So they're actually quite recent. And I would say the most successful people are the ones that do have a good grip of the legislation, treat their business as a business, and treat their tenants as customers and have that level of customer service. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it is about communications and just thinking about, as I mentioned, it hasn't been a big issue, but we have had some. And I remember one person, our process involves, I thought that I would always have to do it. But then Luke took it over because exactly as you said, there's a process. Ours does start, it used to start with a phone call, but we found so many people, it was hard to get through to people on the phone when they're at work and so on. So it does now start with written messages through our property management software, but also we'll go to their phone either on mobile or WhatsApp. But we just do it both through the property management software so that it's always recorded on our system, all of the communications. But anyway, it's the day after, because all of our rents come in the first. So the day after we get in touch with people, and then we keep that up until the payment's received or something else happens. And one person said, actually, do you know what? I'm going to move out because you keep asking me for the rent. so I thought that was quite hilarious, because could you imagine being asked for the rent as a tenant?
Do you know what? Sometimes the things that tenants come out with baffle me, because that's kind of their only job, is to pay the rent. That's it. That's all they've really got in this relationship. So yeah, how the audacity of you asking for the rent.
and the other thing is that people behave differently for different landlords.
Mm-hmm.
The same person. So notice that as well. And it is down to a lot of the things that you were talking about, like even that first telephone conversation. You're late with the rent. Is there something wrong? Or, is everything okay? Or whatever, because you're just opening the door rather than assuming the worst. And mostly people say, oh, my standing order, something happened, or my salary is late this month, or whatever it is. Usually there's a simple explanation, but sometimes it does warrant a little bit more investigation. But I think sometimes people test, especially so they don't pay the rent to see how long it will take before somebody gets in touch. And based on that, they then decide their next course of action.
I absolutely agree with that. And when you're operating an HMO, you do tend to find, especially if the tenants are quite close in regards to their communication in the house, they'll have one brave one that will test it and then all the others will follow suit. So that's why it's really important, like I say, from day one to have that rent arrears policy and set the level of expectation, because then everybody knows exactly where they're standing.
Yes, totally. So, Julie, is there anything else that I haven't asked you about that you wanted to mention today?
I don't think so. I mean, for me, it's just really important for rent-to-rent operators to just understand that communication is the key in anything you do. You know, right at the beginning, when you're getting that rent-to-rent property and the first set of keys in your hand, you have all the skills. You've proved you have all the skills to be able to then pass that on when your tenants are struggling with rent arrears, because you've shown that you've got negotiation skills. So absolutely, anyone that's doing rent to rent, there's no reason why you can't have a good understanding relationship with your tenants and still be able to carry out the business professionally, because you've already proved you've got those skills.
And I know it's something that people worry about, especially when they're just getting started. But I think that this is more of an issue for more established people. For example, when you first take on your property and maybe you've got 5 tenants, you're unlikely there to have one with rent arrears. But if you're managing a portfolio, as we are, with hundreds of tenants, then you definitely will have someone, at least one person, who you're having the conversation with. But the number of people, it can be kept very small and it can be kept very manageable. So I just wanted to reiterate that, because I know that it is a big fear people have, but it's not something that I've seen happening at the beginning. It tends to be something that happens, the more tenants that you build up over time.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's like anything, any business that you start, when you start small, you're able to manage it all yourself, because there's not many customers, you've got the time. As you build that business up and you're getting more properties, you're getting more tenants, it is going to be harder to manage on the individual basis that you have. And that's why you then get staff and have a team around you. And again, it just goes back to what I said before. That's why it's so important to have the systems in place, because then everybody from day one is singing from the same hymn sheet, and the tenants can expect that they're not going to go from you saying, no, you're paying your rent or you're out, to, Susan in accounts who goes, oh, it's okay, I understand your story, don't worry about paying the rent this month. So they're not playing staff off against each other as well. And I've seen that in letting agencies before, where you've got the nice girl in admin, and then you've got the tyrant in rent arrears department, the tenants playing them both off against each other.
Wow. I can't imagine that conversation. Oh, don't worry about paying your rent this month. But never mind. But thank you so much for coming in, Julie. It's been great to have you on the show. I know that people will want to get in contact with you. And if you're watching the video, you'll see it on screen now. It's gothardrow.com if you want to get in touch with Julie, or if you need Julie's services, if you've got rent arrears of your own. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you also for watching and for listening. I look forward to seeing you all again next week. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.